Comprehensive Guide for Scrupulous Believers, a Q&A manual based on Charles Finney's theology. #1 Introduction. Overview of Scrupulosity and Finney's framework. This manual reorganizes the provided points into a question-and-answer format, ensuring every detail is addressed thoroughly without summarization. Each question is phrased as a complete sentence to guide scrupulous believers in understanding their struggles, hypersin consciousness, discernment of sin and temptation, and practical counsel from Finney's framework. The answers draw directly from the content, emphasizing the distinction between the will and sensibility, and aim to provide clarity, peace, and spiritual stability for those with tender consciences. Finney's key insight: sin is only in the will's consent ***, not involuntary thoughts, feelings, or pulls from the *** sensibility ***. This framework frees you to rest in God's promise. Homework. 1. Fill in the blank ***. Finney's theology emphasizes the distinction between the voluntary moral choices and the involuntary feelings. Answer: will, sensibility. 2. Scenario ***. Imagine you're starting this guide but feel overwhelmed. How might Finney advise you to focus on your will's intention rather than emotions? Write a short prayer applying this. 3. Short answer ***. Why is this manual structured as Q&A? Explain in 2-3 sentences how it helps scrupulous believers. 4. Reflection prompt ***. Journal: what tender conscience struggles do I relate to most? How can Finney's framework bring clarity? 5. Multiple choice ***. The goal of this guide is to provide A. Emotional highs, B. Clarity, peace, and stability, C. Strict rules, D. Historical facts. Answer: B. 2. Common struggles of scrupulous believers. Primary areas of struggle and their manifestations. What are the primary areas where scrupulous believers tend to struggle, and how does each manifest in their spiritual life? Scrupulous believers tend to struggle in numerous areas, beginning with confusing temptation with sin, where an intrusive thought appears followed by an emotional pull, causing the conscience to immediately panic and the person to assume guilt. They often reason that because the pull felt strong, their heart must have wanted it, leading to overeating involuntary feelings as guilt, and Finney would emphasize the critical question of whether the will consented. Another area is hyperfocus on internal states through excessive self-examination, where scrupulous believers tend to live with their attention turned inward almost constantly, tangled in self-analysis and fearful of every motive, monitoring every emotional ripple, every passing thought, and every bodily reaction, becoming absorbed in emotional fluctuations that magnify distress and uncertainty. They also struggle with sin consciousness, repeated confessions, and being unsure if they have sinned. Additionally, habit-driven sensibility is misread as present rebellion, such as when someone has a history of pride, lust, fear, or anger, and the will can remain firmly set on God, while the sensibility is still reacting noisily. But the sensibility may continue to fire quickly for a season, and scrupulous believers often interpret these as proof their will is still wrong, expecting emotional perfection too quickly. This involves overanalyzing feelings and not recognizing that many emotional reactions are involuntary. Yet scrupulous minds keep reopening the case, and Finney would more carefully ask what the will is doing now when the feeling arises. Mistaking emotional intensity for moral consent is another struggle, where the sensibility can be loud, persistent, and physiologically intense, while the will is quietly refusing, creating a mismatch between loud feelings and quiet obedience that causes enormous confusion for tender consciences. They have difficulty recognizing quiet obedience, expecting obedience to feel like strong revulsion, emotional clarity, immediate inner relief, or dramatic victory, but when obedience instead looks like a simple inward refusal, a quiet turning to duty, or steady but unspectacular resistance, they often doubt it was real. Waiting for feelings before acting in faith is common, where feelings follow thoughts, and people do not rest in Christ because they are waiting to feel right first, but faith is fundamentally trust in Christ's promise, not a certain emotional state. Doubting if they are born, again, lack of trust, perfectionism, not knowing how to discern between condemnation and accusation, religious voices, fear of deception, not understanding sanctification by faith, doubtful issues, waiting for emotional certainty before trusting, fear of not being fully surrendered, repeated loss of assurance, oversensitivity to minor faults, and spiritual exhaustion and discouragement are further areas. With the latter involving the enemy often pushing tender consciences toward despair through overaccusation, and when scrupulosity persists, it often produces fatigue, hopelessness, spiritual paralysis, and loss of joy. Hyperfocus on internal states excessive self-examination. Scrupulous believers tend to live with their attention turned inward almost constantly, tangled in self-analysis, fearful of every motive. They monitor every emotional ripple, every passing thought, every bodily reaction, becoming absorbed in emotional fluctuations. This magnifies distress and uncertainty. Habit-driven sensibility misread as present rebellion. If someone has a history of pride, lust, fear, or anger, the will can remain firmly set on God while the sensibility is still reacting noisily. The sensibility may continue to fire quickly for a season, and scrupulous believers often interpret these as proof their will is still wrong. They are expecting emotional perfection too quickly. This involves overanalyzing feelings, not recognizing many emotional reactions are involuntary, but scrupulous minds keep reopening the case. Finney would more carefully ask, what is the will doing now when the feeling arises? Mistaking emotional intensity for moral consent. The sensibility can be loud, persistent, physiologically intense, while the will is quietly refusing. This mismatch between loud feelings and quiet obedience creates enormous confusion for tender consciences. Difficulty recognizing quiet obedience. Scrupulous believers expect obedience to feel like strong revulsion, emotional clarity, immediate inner relief, dramatic victory. When obedience instead looks like a simple inward refusal, a quiet turning to duty, steady but unspectacular resistance, they often doubt it was real. Waiting for feelings before acting in faith. Feelings follow thoughts, people who would not rest in Christ because they were waiting to feel right first. Faith is fundamentally trust in Christ's promise, not a certain emotional state. Doubting born-again status, lack of trust, and perfectionism. Doubting if they are born again, lack of trust, perfectionism. Discernment challenges, condemnation versus accusation, religious voices, fear of deception. Don't know how to discern between condemnation and accusation, religious voices, fear of deception. Not understanding sanctification by faith, doubtful issues, and fear of full surrender. Don't understand sanctification by faith, doubtful issues, waiting for emotional certainty before trusting, fear of not being fully surrendered. Repeated loss of assurance and oversensitivity to minor faults. Repeated loss of assurance, oversensitivity to minor faults. Spiritual exhaustion and discouragement. The enemy often pushes tender consciences toward despair through overaccusation. When scrupulosity persists, it often produces fatigue, hopelessness, spiritual paralysis, loss of joy. Homework. 1 fill in the blank ***. Scrupulous believers often confuse with sin, where an intrusive appears followed by an emotional pull. Answer: temptation, thought. 2 scenario ***. You're experiencing a noisy sensibility from past habits like anger. Describe how Finney would advise you to respond, focusing on the will's role. Then, role-play a short journal entry applying it to your day. 3 short answer. List 3 manifestations of spiritual exhaustion from scrupulosity and explain how overaccusation contributes. 3-5 sentences. 4 multiple choice ***. Finney's key question for discerning consent is: A. How loud was the feeling? B. Did the will consent? C. How long did the emotion linger? D. Was the thought disturbing? Answer: B. 5 reflection prompt. Identify one struggle from this section, e.g., doubting born-again status. How does confusing sensibility with will worsen it? Pray and journal a step to re-anchor in your will's choice. 6 practical application ***. Track 1 day of quiet obedience, e.g. simple refusal without dramatic feelings. Note instances and how it felt versus your expectations. #3 Hypersyn consciousness, diagnosis and cure. What is hypersyn consciousness and how does it manifest? What is hypersyn consciousness and how does it manifest in the lives of scrupulous believers? Hypersyn consciousness is when the conscience becomes so overactivated that the person lives in chronic self-examination, even while sincerely seeking to obey God, and it is not the same as healthy conviction. Instead, their awareness of sin has become excessive, distorted, and spiritually unproductive, functioning as an overactivated, inward-locked conscience that misreads the normal noise of the sensibility as ongoing guilt, with the primary cure being to re-anchor in the will's sincere obedience, while learning to rest by faith rather than continually self-scan. It looks like constantly scanning themselves for sin and scanning emotions. interpreting every emotion, impulse, feeling, or desire as guilt, because they don't know that sensibilities are involuntary and what matters is the right will. As a result, they fear themselves and feel like they have to constantly watch themselves lest they sin, feeling spiritually unclean most of the time because they are under false guilt for temptation and involuntary sensibilities. They think something is wrong with them, believe they have a sinful nature even though their governing preference is to do God's will, and they don't know their identity in Christ. It involves repeated self-questioning, replaying past actions and continual motive checking, mistaking feelings and desires for sin, fear of self-deception such as fearing false peace, grieving the Spirit unknowingly, not being right with God, not being fully surrendering, and questioning their sincerity. Chronic stress, poor sleep, trauma history, or burnout can heighten rumination, intrusive thoughts, anxiety loops, and emotional reactions. They second-guess ordinary decisions, worry about hidden motives, replay conversations afterward, fear accidental wrongdoing, feel unsafe spiritually most of the time, struggle to retain settled peace, and ask repeatedly, "What if I did this wrong?" Their problem is not rebellion, but misinterpretation of the sensibility, including mistaking involuntary thoughts for consent and overreading emotional reactions. How to overcome hypersin consciousness. How can scrupulous believers overcome hypersin consciousness according to the provided guidance? To overcome hypersin consciousness, scrupulous believers should re-anchor moral judgment in the will's governing choice, repeatedly returning to the central question of what their will is choosing when the temptation appears, not focusing on how loud the feeling was, how disturbing the thought was, or how long the emotion lingered, but asking whether they consented or refused, as this alone resolves many false condemnations. They should shift from self-monitoring to God-trust, embracing childlike reliance rather than self-management, acting on known light and stopping reopening settled matters, where when something has been honestly confessed, sincerely forsaken, and the will is presently right, it should not be endlessly retried in the court of conscience, as chronic reopening often feeds the cycle. They must accept that the sensibility retrains gradually, recognizing that emotional patterns often lag behind the will, confusing the sensibility with the will, and they must be taught that the sensibility often reacts involuntarily due to habit, association, physical state, or external triggers. When believers do not understand this distinction, they may interpret temptation as consent and live under unnecessary guilt, often misunderstanding the role of feelings and thinking that if their heart were right, they would feel consistently different. But emotions fluctuate for many reasons including physical fatigue, hormones, past conditioning, and nervous system sensitivity. Finally, they should restore healthy rhythms of body and life, including adequate sleep, reduced overstimulation, physical regulation, stress management, and community connection. Special case, discernment when unsure about lying or sinning. How should scrupulous believers discern whether they have lied or sinned when they are constantly unsure about their words or actions? When a person is constantly unsure whether they have lied or sinned, they should ask whether the will intended to deceive, and if the will was honestly trying to tell the truth. Finney would usually not classify the act as a lie, even if the wording was imperfect. In his moral framework, lying requires voluntary intention to mislead, conscious design to mislead, known falsehoods spoken deliberately, half-truths, or intentional creation of a false impression, but not imperfect wording, memory mistakes, imprecise speech, misunderstood statements, or unwanted intrusive doubts afterward. Overscrupulous believers tend to overinterpret normal human imprecision, treat uncertainty as guilt, and ignore the governing intention of the will. The counsel is to anchor moral judgment in honest intention, speak plainly and simply, correct clear mistakes promptly, refuse endless post-conversation retrials, and accept normal human imperfection in speech. Homework. 1. Fill in the blank ***. Hypersin consciousness is an overactivated conscience that misreads as ongoing guilt. Answer: the normal noise of the sensibility. 2. Scenario ***. You're replaying a conversation, fearing you misled someone unintentionally. Using Finney's counsel, what question would you ask about your will? Role-play the self-examination. 3. Short answer. Describe 3 manifestations of hypersin consciousness, e.g., fearing self-deception, and how chronic stress heightens them. 3-5 sentences. 4. Multiple choice ***. The primary cure for hypersin consciousness is a Mori self-scan, B. Re-anchor in will's obedience, C. Ignore feelings, D. Endless confessions. Answer B. 5. Reflection prompt ***. Journal how misinterpreting sensibility as rebellion affects you. List 1 rhythm, e.g., sleep, to restore and plan implementation. 6. Practical application ***. For one day, practice stopping reopening a settled matter. Note how it reduces anxiety. #4. Finney's core framework, will versus sensibility. Finney's warning on scrupulosity and avoiding false guilt. What was Charles Finney's warning about scrupulosity and avoiding false guilt, and how did he help believers discern temptation from sin? Charles Finney was very aware that some sincere Christians falsely accuse themselves of sin when they are actually resisting temptation, and he warned that confusing temptation with consent can lead to unnecessary guilt, discouragement, and spiritual instability. To help someone discern this clearly and avoid scrupulosity, Finney emphasized that temptation itself is not proof of sin, belonging to the sensibility, not the will, and many people mistakenly believe that if they feel it strongly they must have consented, but this is false in his theology, as the strength of a feeling does not prove consent, and the only thing that proves sin is the will's choice to embrace it. He would say temptation proves you are being tempted, not that you have sinned. The presence of unwanted thoughts or feelings often proves the will is opposing them, as Finney would point out that if you are disturbed by a thought, resisting it, and rejecting it, this itself is evidence that your will is not consenting, and the distress itself shows opposition, while if the will had truly embraced it there would be inward agreement, not resistance, so resistance is evidence of obedience, not sin. Scrupulous people often mistake involuntary thoughts for voluntary intention, but Finney taught that thoughts can enter the mind involuntarily through memory, association, external stimuli, or emotional triggers, and the will did not create them, only deciding what to do with them, so scrupulosity falsely treats involuntary thoughts as voluntary choices, which Finney rejected completely. The key question is not whether the thought occurred but whether the will embraced it, directing a person away from analyzing feelings and toward examining intention, asking if they chose it, wanted it, embraced it, or rejected it, and if the will rejected it, there is no sin, even if the thought was vivid or persistent. Finney warned that excessive self-accusation can weaken spiritual stability, producing confusion, discouragement, emotional instability, and loss of confidence in obedience, distracting from actual obedience, and he taught that peace comes from recognizing the true state of the will, not from achieving emotional perfection. The will can remain fully obedient while the sensibility is in conflict. As Finney emphasized that emotional conflict does not equal moral conflict, and a person may feel strong opposing desires while the will remains fully set on God, which is not hypocrisy but the normal condition of moral testing, with the will determining character, not emotional calmness. Finney would say false guilt often comes from misunderstanding the nature of moral responsibility, believing people are only responsible for what they choose, not for what they feel involuntarily or what appears in the mind involuntarily, and only for what the will consents to, which was central to his theology. One of Finney's clearest practical tests is if you could honestly choose to remove the temptation instantly, would you? And if the answer is yes, your will is not consenting and is opposed to it, proving obedience, as consent involves willingness while resistance involves unwillingness. He taught that the governing intention defines the heart, not passing mental states, believing the heart is defined by its supreme intention, not by momentary thoughts or emotional fluctuations, and if your governing intention is to please God, that defines your character, even if opposing feelings arise. Finney would say that wrongly accusing yourself of consent when you are resisting is itself a mistake of judgment, not proof of sin, and the error is intellectual misunderstanding, not moral rebellion, with the solution being clarity, not repentance for something you did not choose. In Finney's framework, many sincere believers falsely accuse themselves of sin when they are actually resisting temptation, emphasizing that involuntary thoughts, desires, and feelings are not sin unless the will consents to them, and the true test is whether the will embraces or rejects the temptation. If the will rejects it and remains set on pleasing God, there is obedience, even if the temptation is strong, persistent, or emotionally disturbing. Direct quotes and core principles on the will versus sensibility. What are Charles Finney's direct quotes and core principles on the will versus the sensibility? From Charles Finney's lectures on systematic theology, moral character belongs solely to the ultimate intention of the will, and the sensibility has no moral character. The states of the sensibility are involuntary and therefore can have no moral character in themselves. Desire is not itself sin, and it is only when the will yields to desire and chooses gratification that sin exists. All sin consists in selfishness, or in the will's choosing self-gratification as the supreme end. The sensibility is not directly under the control of the will. Temptation is not itself sin, and it is only the yielding of the will that constitutes sin. The will is not necessitated by the sensibility. Holiness consists in the supreme, ultimate intention of the will. The feelings will come to correspond with the action of the will. there can be no sin without a voluntary transgression of known law. In Finney's framework, feelings arise involuntarily, desire itself is not sin, temptation itself is not sin, sin occurs only when the will consents, and moral character belongs only to the will's governing intention. These teachings are available in public domain texts, such as Systematic Theology at https://www.gutenberg.org/ebooks/37698, Lectures to Professing Christians at https://www.gutenberg.org/ebooks/37745. Sermons on Important Subjects at https://www.gutenberg.org/ebooks/37730, and the Oberlin Evangelist Sermons Archive at https://www.truthandheart.com/Oberlin-Evangelist/. In Finney's own theological terms, temptation, desire, and emotional impulses arise involuntarily in the sensibility and are not themselves sin. And sin exists only when the will voluntarily consents to self-gratification, instead of choosing God as the supreme end. So a person whose will remains set on pleasing God is obedient, even if contrary feelings and temptations arise. Detailed explanation of intellect, sensibility, and will. What is Charles Finney's detailed explanation of the intellect, sensibility, and will? Charles Finney explains the difference between the intellect, sensibility, and will most clearly in his lectures on systematic theology, especially in the section titled Moral Agency, which is the foundation of his entire understanding of temptation, sin, and obedience. The intellect perceives and presents information, defined as the faculty that perceives truth, forms ideas, reasons, judges, and presents options to the will, and Finney wrote that the intellect is the faculty that thinks, reasons, judges, and forms ideas. The intellect does not choose but only presents knowledge, for example recognizing that this action would please God or this action would please self, presenting both options but not deciding between them. The sensibility produces feelings and desires automatically, defined as the faculty of feeling, and Finney wrote that the sensibility is the faculty of feeling, with all pleasure and pain belonging to it, including desires, emotions, attractions, aversions, impulses, and emotional reactions. Most importantly, Finney emphasized that the states of the sensibility are involuntary, meaning you do not directly choose your feelings, and they arise automatically in response to what the intellect perceives. For example, if the intellect perceives praise, the sensibility may produce pleasure, or if it perceives danger, the sensibility produces fear, occurring automatically and not by moral choice. The will is the only faculty that makes moral choices, defined as the governing faculty, and Finney wrote that the will is the executive faculty, choosing or refusing choice, and most importantly that the will alone is the faculty of moral agency, meaning only the will can sin, only the will can obey God, and only the will determines moral character, not the intellect or the sensibility. The will chooses the supreme end of life, which is Finney's most important concept, teaching that the will sets the supreme intention, and Finney wrote that the ultimate intention of the will determines moral character, choosing between God as the supreme end or self as the supreme end, with this governing choice defining the heart, not passing feelings. The sensibility does not control the will, as Finney explicitly rejected the idea that feelings control choice, writing that the will is not necessitated by the sensibility, meaning feelings influence but do not force, and the will remains free even under strong emotional pressure. The sensibility responds automatically to what the intellect presents, with the sequence being that the intellect perceives something, the sensibility produces feelings automatically, and the will chooses how to respond. For example, you see praise, the intellect perceives it, the sensibility produces pleasure or pride impulse, then the will chooses to embrace pride sin or reject pride, obedience, and the feeling itself was not sin, with the choice determining sin. The will indirectly influences the sensibility over time, as Finney taught that while the will cannot instantly control feelings, it influences them indirectly, writing that the will can direct the attention and thus indirectly influence the sensibility, and by choosing what to focus on, the will reshapes emotional patterns, with over time the sensibility aligning with the will, explaining spiritual growth. The sensibility may conflict with the will without moral guilt, which is extremely important in Finney's theology, teaching that opposing feelings do not mean opposing intention, and the will may fully choose God while the sensibility produces contrary desires, which is temptation, not sin, and sin occurs only if the will consents. Finney's complete structure summarized in his own framework is that the intellect knows, perceives, and presents options, the sensibility feels, desires, and reacts automatically, and the will chooses, governs, and determines moral character, with only the will sinning and only the will obeying. Finney's clearest summary quote is from Systematic Theology, the intellect perceives, the sensibility feels, and the will chooses, which single sentence summarizes his entire psychology. A simple real-life example using Finney's framework is that you are insulted, the intellect recognizes the insult, the sensibility produces anger automatically, and the will chooses either revenge, sin, or forgiveness, obedience, with the anger feeling itself not being sin, and the will's choice determining sin. These can be read directly in Finney's own writing in the public domain full text of Systematic Theology. See the Moral Agency section at https://www.org/files/37698/37698h/37698h, HTM, specifically looking for the intellect, the sensibility, and the will, which explain everything in detail. According to Finney, the intellect perceives truth. The sensibility produces feelings involuntarily, and the will alone makes moral choices. Temptation arises in the sensibility automatically, but sin occurs only when the will consents to self-gratification instead of choosing God as the supreme end, and the governing intention of the will, not involuntary feelings, determines the true state of the heart. Text diagram, the three faculties. Intellect perceives right arrow presence options. Down arrow. Sensibility, involuntary feelings, desires. Down arrow. WALL chooses supreme end. God or self. Right arrow determines moral character. Sequence in temptation asterisk. Intellect sees right arrow sensibility, pulls right arrow will decides, refuse equals obedience, consent equals sin. Homework. 1 fill in the blank asterisk asterisk. According to Finney, moral character belongs solely to the ultimate of the will. Answer: intention. 2 scenario asterisk asterisk. You're tempted by anger. Describe each faculty's role, intellect, sensibility, will, and how consent fits. 3 short answer asterisk. Explain Finney's quote. The sensibility is not directly under the control of the will. How does this free scrupulous believers? 3 sentences. 4 multiple choice asterisk. The will's role is: A. Produce feelings, B. Perceive truth, C. Make moral choices, D. All above. Answer: C. 5 reflection prompt asterisk. Journal a real-life example like Finney's insult scenario from your week. How did your will respond? 6 practical application. Read 1 original link, e.g. Systematic Theology. Note 1 quote on will versus sensibility and apply to struggle. 5 discerning temptation, consent, and sin. Why a fully consecrated will can still experience unwanted desires without hypocrisy. Why can a fully consecrated will still experience unwanted desires without hypocrisy, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney directly addressed the concern of how a person can be fully consecrated in their will, and yet still experience unwanted desires, impulses, or feelings without being a hypocrite, with his answer resting entirely on the distinction between the ultimate intention of the will and the involuntary states of the sensibility. Consecration belongs to the will, not the sensibility, as Finney taught that true consecration is an act of the will setting God as its supreme end, writing in Systematic Theology that holiness consists in the supreme, ultimate intention of the will, noticing what he does not say, that holiness does not consist in having no contrary feelings, but in the will's governing intention, meaning a person can be fully consecrated in their will even while their sensibility produces contrary feelings. The sensibility continues to produce involuntary feelings even after full consecration, as Finney explicitly taught that the sensibility is involuntary, and its states are not under the direct control of the will, meaning even after the will fully chooses God, the sensibility may still produce emotional impulses, sudden desires, attractions, feelings of pride, or feelings of fear, and these do not originate in the will but arise automatically, not contradicting consecration unless the will consents to them. Hypocrisy exists only when the will secretly chooses self, not when feelings conflict with the will, as Finney defined hypocrisy as a divided ultimate intention, where the will claims to choose God outwardly but inwardly chooses self, but this is very different from involuntary feelings, and if the will truly chooses God and rejects selfish desires, there is no hypocrisy, even if those desires appear in the sensibility, with hypocrisy being a choice of the will, not a condition of the sensibility. Finney taught that temptation itself can exist alongside full obedience, writing clearly that temptation is not sin, and it is only when the will yields to temptation that sin exists, meaning temptation and obedience can exist at the same time, with temptation occurring in the sensibility and obedience occurring in the will, and if the will refuses consent, obedience remains intact. Christ himself experienced temptation while remaining perfectly consecrated, as Finney used Christ as the ultimate example, who experienced intense hunger, emotional agony, distress, and temptation, yet remained perfectly holy, because his will never consented to self-gratification, proving temptation does not contradict consecration. The will and sensibility can temporarily be in conflict without moral contradiction, as Finney explained that the sensibility reflects natural laws, past conditioning, and external stimuli, and it does not instantly conform to the will but gradually aligns, with this temporary conflict not being hypocrisy but part of the normal structure of moral agency, and the will determines moral character, not the sensibility. The true test of consecration is what the will does with temptation, as Finney would ask when temptation appears what the will does, whether it embraces it or rejects it, and if it rejects it, consecration is genuine, even if the temptation feels strong, with the strength of temptation not determining consecration but the will's response doing so. Finney taught that emotional harmony develops gradually after consecration, explaining that the sensibility gradually comes into harmony with the will, writing that the feelings will come to correspond with the state of the will, happening progressively, not instantly, with consecration being immediate but emotional harmony following gradually. Finney's clearest summary principle is that consecration is a voluntary choice of the will to make God the supreme end of life, and tempting feelings that arise involuntarily do not contradict consecration unless the will consents to them. Finney's simplest illustration based on his principles is that a loyal person may feel fear but still choose courage, and the fear does not make them disloyal, only choosing betrayal would. Likewise, unwanted desires do not make a person unconsecrated, only consenting to them would. According to Finney, a person can be fully consecrated in their will and still experience unwanted desires, because those desires arise in the sensibility, which operates involuntarily. Consecration belongs to the ultimate intention of the will, not to the involuntary states of feeling. Therefore, temptation does not make a person a hypocrite unless the will consents to it, and the true state of the heart is determined by the governing choice of the will, not by the presence or strength of involuntary desires. The exact moment temptation turns into sin, precise psychological terms. What is Charles Finney's explanation of the exact moment when temptation turns into sin, in precise psychological terms? Charles Finney was extremely precise about the exact moment temptation becomes sin, locating that moment entirely in the will's voluntary consent, not in the feeling, not in the thought, and not in the initial desire, teaching that temptation becomes sin at the precise instant the will embraces self-gratification as an end instead of continuing to reject it. Temptation begins when the intellect perceives something and the sensibility produces desire, which is the first stage, the mind perceiving something, the sensibility producing a corresponding emotional response automatically, which may include fear, pride, lust, anxiety, or selfish impulse, this stage being involuntary. Teaching this stage has no moral character, not sin but simply temptation. The critical moment of moral agency is the will's awareness and choice, with the will becoming aware of the desire and must choose how to respond, now facing two possible directions: reject the desire or embrace the desire, this choice determining whether sin occurs, the desire itself not determining sin, but the will's choice determining sin. The precise instant sin begins is the will's consent, defined as the will's choice of self-gratification as the supreme end. This consent may be quiet, internal, subtle, not requiring outward action, occurring entirely within the will. The moment the will inwardly says yes, sin exists, before that moment no sin, only temptation. Consent is an act of inward agreement, not a feeling, with consent not feeling like the desire itself but like willingness, a shift from resistance to allowance, the will stopping opposing the desire and adopting it even briefly, that shift being the precise moment sin begins, not the emotional pull but the will's agreement. No sin as long as refusal continues, regardless of intensity. As long as the will continues to refuse the desire, no sin occurs. Even if the desire remains strong, the thought repeats, emotional pressure continues. If the will continues to refuse consent, obedience remains complete, emphasizing this strongly that temptation without consent is not sin no matter how intense. The will can refuse while the sensibility keeps producing desire. Teaching that the sensibility and will can temporarily conflict, the sensibility producing desire, the will rejecting it, which is temptation not sin, sin requiring the will to change sides. As long as the will remains opposed, no sin. The transition occurs entirely within the will, not in the body, not in the emotions, not in the intellect, only in the will determining moral character, not the intensity of desire, not the presence of intrusive thoughts, only consent. Consent is always voluntary, never forced, insisting that the will is free. No desire can force consent. no emotion can force consent, consent always chosen, preserving moral responsibility. Without voluntary consent, sin cannot exist. Sin can exist without outward action, if inward consent occurs, teaching that outward behavior is not the defining moment. The defining moment is inward intention, outward action expressing the will, but sin beginning before outward action at consent. Temptation becomes sin at the exact moment the will voluntarily consents to self-gratification, instead of continuing to choose obedience to God. Before consent, temptation only; after consent, sin exists. Finney's simple timeline illustration is: Stage 1, thought or desire appears, not sin. Stage 2, emotional pull is felt, not sin. Stage 3 will rejects the desire, obedience. Stage 4 will embraces the desire, sin begins here, the precise moment being the will's inward embrace. Finney's simplest one-sentence explanation is: sin does not consist in feeling temptation, but in the will's consenting to it. According to Finney, temptation becomes sin at the precise moment the will voluntarily consents to self-gratification as its end. The appearance of desire, emotional pull, or intrusive thoughts does not constitute sin. Only the will's inward agreement transforms temptation into sin. As long as the will continues to refuse consent, the person remains fully obedient regardless of the strength or persistence of temptation. Text timeline, temptation to sin. Stage 1, thought desire appears, involuntary, not sin. Stage 2, emotional pull felt, involuntary, not sin. Stage 3, awareness of pull, not sin. Stage 4, WLLDCIDS. Refuses, right arrow, obedience, no sin. Consents, right arrow, sin begins here. Emotional intensity versus moral consent. Mistaking emotional intensity for moral consent is another struggle, where the sensibility can be loud, persistent, and physiologically intense, while the will is quietly refusing, creating a mismatch between loud feelings and quiet obedience that causes enormous confusion for tender consciences. Consent of the will, precise internal definition. What is Charles Finney's precise definition of what consent of the will actually feels like internally? Charles Finney defined consent of the will very precisely, teaching that it is not a feeling, not a sensation, and not the presence of desire, but a voluntary inward decision to embrace self-gratification as an end, with understanding this distinction being critical, because many people confuse temptation felt in the sensibility with consent chosen in the will. Consent of the will is an inward choice, not a feeling, as Finney taught that the will does not feel but chooses, writing that the will is the faculty of choice and it chooses the end to be secured, with consent being when the will says in substance, I will have this, not necessarily in words but in intention, a voluntary embracing, not merely experiencing a desire, and a desire may exist without consent, with consent being choosing the desire's fulfillment as an end. Consent involves inward agreement with the desire, meaning the will stops opposing the temptation and begins agreeing with it. With this agreement may be quiet and internal, not dramatic, not emotional, but real when the will sides with the temptation instead of opposing it. And Finney defined sin as the will's consenting to self-gratification, with consent being the dividing line where temptation becomes sin. Consent feels like willingness, not mere attraction, which is one of the clearest ways to recognize it, with temptation feeling like I am being pulled, but consent feeling like I am willing, temptation presenting and consent embracing, temptation being involuntary and consent being voluntary, even if subtle. Consent often includes mentally indulging the temptation, as Finney taught that inward indulgence is real consent, including deliberately dwelling on it, replaying it voluntarily, enjoying it mentally, choosing not to resist it, even without outward action, because the will has chosen gratification inwardly, emphasizing that sin begins in the will, not the outward act. Consent removes inward resistance, with when the will is resisting temptation there being inward opposition, but consent removing that opposition, the will stopping resisting and allowing the desire, even if outward restraint remains, and outward restraint alone not determining obedience, the will determining obedience. Consent is always voluntary, never forced, as Finney insisted that no feeling can force consent, writing that the will cannot be compelled by the sensibility, meaning no matter how strong a feeling is, consent is still a choice, preserving moral responsibility, and without voluntary consent there is no sin. Consent is the adoption of self-gratification as the end, even temporarily, as Finney taught that sin always involves choosing self as the supreme end, even temporarily, with consent being when the will adopts self-gratification instead of obedience to God, even briefly, the governing intention shifting in that moment, and that shift being sin. Lack of consent feels like inward refusal, even if feelings remain strong, with when the will refuses consent there being a settled inward stance like no, I will not choose this, even if the feelings remain intense, even if the temptation persists, the will remaining set against it, which is obedience, not sin, the presence of desire not equaling consent, only the will's embrace equaling consent. Finney taught that consent is always recognizable by honest self-examination, believing that people can know whether they have consented by examining their intention honestly, not their feelings but their choice, with the will being conscious of its own choices, and consent not being unconscious but a real inward decision. Consent of the will is the voluntary inward choice to embrace self-gratification as an end, rather than choosing obedience to God. Temptation presents the option, consent chooses it, and without consent there is no sin. A simple real-life example using Finney's framework is temptation, where you feel pride rise, consent being choosing to embrace the pride and enjoying the idea of self-exaltation, refusal being rejecting it inwardly and choosing humility, even if the feeling lingers, with the will's choice determining the moral state. According to Finney, consent of the will is not a feeling but a voluntary inward decision to embrace self-gratification instead of obedience to God. Temptation consists of involuntary desires arising in the sensibility, but sin occurs only when the will willingly agrees with and adopts those desires as its end. If the will refuses consent and remains set on pleasing God, there is obedience, even if strong temptation continues. Subtle consent, detection and prevention. Why can consent sometimes happen very subtly, and how did Charles Finney teach believers to detect and prevent even small acts of inward consent? Charles Finney warned that consent of the will can sometimes happen very subtly, not as a dramatic decision, but as a quiet inward shift from resistance to willingness, teaching that believers must learn to detect these subtle movements, not by analyzing feelings, but by examining the direction of the will and attention. Consent often begins as a quiet relaxation of resistance, not always feeling like saying I choose sin, but often beginning as simply stopping resistance, with instead of actively rejecting the temptation the will becoming passive, this passivity itself being a choice, resistance ceasing, the will allowing the desire to remain without opposing it, which is often the first subtle step of consent, and he taught that obedience requires active refusal, not mere inactivity. Consent often shows itself through voluntarily dwelling on the temptation, as Finney emphasized that attention reveals the will's intention, and if the mind voluntarily continues to dwell on the temptation, this indicates the will is no longer fully resisting, teaching that the will governs attention. So when attention remains on the temptation voluntarily, it shows inward allowance, even if the person does not outwardly act on it, which is why he emphasized redirecting attention quickly. Consent often appears as inward sympathy with the temptation, teaching that when the will is fully obedient, it inwardly sides with God against the temptation, but when consent begins, the will starts sympathizing with the temptation, a subtle inward agreement, not necessarily full surrender but a movement toward willingness, with this inward sympathy indicating the will is shifting its alignment. Consent often occurs before outward action, and even before full conscious realization, teaching that sin always begins in the will, with outward actions simply expressing inward consent, and this inward shift can happen quickly and quietly, sometimes before outward behavior changes, which is why he emphasized guarding the will itself, not merely outward conduct. Consent strengthens temptation immediately, teaching that when the will consents, even subtly, temptation gains strength because consent reinforces the desire, making future resistance harder, but when the will refuses consent, temptation weakens, governed by fixed laws of mind. The clearest sign of non-consent is active inward refusal, teaching that true obedience involves a definite inward stance, a real choice against the temptation, not passive avoidance but active rejection, even if calm and quiet, which preserves obedience regardless of feelings. Finney taught that immediate refusal prevents consent from developing, with the safest response being immediate rejection, not debate, not analysis, not prolonged attention, as immediate refusal prevents the will from drifting toward consent, and delay increases vulnerability, quick refusal preserving inward stability. Consent can be prevented by maintaining a firm, settled governing intention toward God, teaching that when the will remains firmly established in choosing God as its supreme end, temptations lose their persuasive power, the will remaining steady, which prevents inward shifting, with stability of intention being protective. Finney emphasized honesty with oneself, teaching that self-deception occurs when people ignore or excuse subtle inward consent, with honest self-examination preventing this, not obsessive introspection, but honest recognition of the will's true choice, and the will knowing whether it has embraced or rejected temptation. Consent occurs when the will stops opposing temptation and begins allowing or embracing it, even subtly, and obedience consists in maintaining active inward refusal and choosing God as the supreme end, regardless of what feelings are present. Finney's simple analogy is imagining holding a door shut against pressure, resistance keeping the door closed, consent beginning the moment you stop resisting, even if you do not open it fully, the release of resistance allowing movement, maintaining resistance keeping the door closed. According to Finney, consent can occur subtly when the will relaxes its resistance, allows attention to dwell on temptation, or inwardly sympathizes with it. This may happen quietly before outward action. Finney taught that consent is prevented by immediate refusal, redirecting attention, maintaining a firm governing intention toward God, and honest self-awareness. The key issue is not the presence of temptation, but whether the will actively resists or allows it. Momentary mental attention versus actual consent. What is the distinction between momentary mental attention and actual consent, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney made a very important and precise distinction between momentary mental attention and actual consent of the will, because many people mistakenly assume that merely noticing or momentarily focusing on a thought means they have sinned, but Finney taught that this is not true, with the key issue being not whether attention briefly occurs, but whether the will adopts the thought as its end. Momentary attention can occur involuntarily and is not itself sin, teaching that when a thought, image, or feeling appears, the mind naturally becomes aware of it. This initial awareness, often including momentary attention, happening automatically as part of how the intellect functions, the will not creating the thought, not inviting it, simply becoming aware of it, this awareness having no moral character by itself, not consent but perception. The will must decide whether to retain or dismiss the thought. Once the thought becomes present, the will having a choice to dismiss it or retain and entertain it, this choice determining whether sin occurs, the thought's presence not determining sin, but the will's response determining sin, emphasizing that the will governs whether attention continues voluntarily. Consent begins when the will chooses to entertain or embrace the thought, teaching that consent occurs when the will chooses to dwell on the thought, allows it to remain voluntarily, embraces its gratification, inwardly adopts it, which is more than momentary attention but voluntary indulgence, inward agreement, the moment sin begins. Momentary attention while resisting is not consent, being very clear about this. A person may briefly notice or even momentarily attend to a thought while the will is still opposing it, not sin because the will has not embraced it, the will remaining set against it, the attention part of awareness, not indulgence, what matters being whether the will chooses to retain or reject it. Consent involves willingness. Involuntary attention does not. One of Finney's most important distinctions that consent includes inward willingness. Momentary attention does not. Consent saying in substance I will allow this, resistance saying I refuse this even if the thought lingers briefly, the will stance determining obedience. The will reveals its intention by what it chooses to focus on voluntarily, teaching that the will governs sustained attention. If attention continues because the will chooses it, this is indulgence. If attention is redirected because the will refuses it, this is obedience. The key distinction: voluntary continuation, not initial awareness. Emotional reaction during momentary attention does not equal consent, teaching that emotional responses may occur automatically when a thought appears, belonging to the sensibility not the will. Even if emotional reactions occur, no sin unless the will embraces them. The will may still reject the thought fully, emotional response alone, not consent. The will remains obedient as long as it refuses inward agreement, emphasizing that obedience consists in the will's governing intention. As long as the will refuses to adopt the thought as its end, obedience remains complete even if attention briefly occurred, even if emotional reaction occurred, consent alone determining sin. Momentary mental attention to a thought is not sin. Sin occurs only when the will voluntarily consents to and embraces the thought as its end. Finney's simple example is: a fearful thought appears, you notice it. For a moment your mind focuses on it, but inwardly you reject it. You redirect your attention, this not sin. Your will never consented, consent being choosing to dwell on it, embracing it inwardly, allowing it voluntarily, that is the difference. According to Finney, momentary mental attention is part of involuntary mental awareness and does not constitute sin. Sin occurs only when the will voluntarily chooses to retain, entertain, or embrace the thought. The moral character of the person is determined by the will's consent, not by involuntary attention or emotional response. Temporary increase in temptation when resisting. Why does temptation sometimes become more frequent temporarily when someone first begins consistently resisting it, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney taught that temptation may sometimes become more frequent or more noticeable temporarily when a person first begins consistently resisting it. and he gave several clear reasons rooted in his understanding of the sensibility, habit, attention, and moral agency, not seeing this as evidence of failure, but often as evidence that the will has truly changed. Because resistance exposes desires that were previously indulged automatically, before the will is fully set against sin, indulgence may occur almost automatically without much internal conflict. But once the will begins firmly resisting, those same desires are no longer being gratified, now felt as opposition, teaching that resistance makes temptation more noticeable, not necessarily stronger but more consciously perceived, with previously little resistance but now conscious refusal. Making the conflict more visible, because habits that were reinforced in the past continue producing momentum, believing the sensibility follows laws of habit and association, and when a desire has been repeatedly indulged in the past, the sensibility has been conditioned to produce it more readily, and when the will stops consenting, the habit does not instantly disappear, but continues producing impulses for a time. Not because the will still agrees, but because the sensibility is still operating according to previous conditioning, with this momentum gradually weakening as indulgence stops. Because withdrawing indulgence initially causes the sensibility to react more actively, understanding that when indulgence is withdrawn, the sensibility may temporarily react more strongly, not because the will is failing, but because the emotional system was accustomed to gratification, and when gratification stops, the system continues producing impulses out of habit, with over time, without reinforcement, these impulses weaken, part of the realignment process. Because attention becomes more spiritually alert, when a person becomes serious about obedience, their awareness increases, noticing things they previously ignored, teaching that spiritual awakening increases moral awareness, with temptations that were once unnoticed or tolerated becoming more visible, which is not new sin but new clarity, that will now aligned with truth, so it recognizes temptation more clearly. Because temptation presents alternatives necessary for moral freedom, believing moral agency requires real alternatives, with temptation presenting those alternatives, and as the will strengthens in obedience, temptation may present itself repeatedly, not because obedience is weak, but because moral agency involves continual opportunity for choice, each refusal strengthening the governing intention. Because weakening old desires is a gradual process governed by fixed laws, teaching that the sensibility gradually conforms to the will through habit and attention, writing in substance that feelings come to correspond with the governing intention of the will, this process taking time, not because the will is incomplete, but because emotional patterns adjust progressively, consistent refusal leading to gradual weakening. Because resistance itself is strengthening the will's governing intention, believing that each act of refusal strengthens obedience, resistance reinforcing the will's commitment to God, making obedience more stable even if temptation still appears temporarily, resistance building inward stability, not weakness. Finney warned that increased temptation does not mean increased sin, emphasizing that temptation itself is not sin, only consent is sin, and a person may experience frequent temptation while remaining fully obedient, the presence of temptation not defining the moral state, but the will's choice defining the moral state. Finney taught that consistent refusal inevitably weakens temptation, teaching that temptation weakens through disuse. When the will consistently refuses indulgence, the emotional reinforcement stops. Without reinforcement, desire loses strength, governed by fixed psychological and spiritual laws, gradual but reliable. Temptation may temporarily appear more frequently when indulgence stops, because the sensibility continues operating according to previous habits and conditioning. However, as the will consistently refuses consent and maintains its governing intention toward God, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony, and temptation loses its power. Finney's simple analogy is if a wheel has been spinning for a long time, it continues spinning after power is removed, not because new force is being applied, but because of existing momentum, eventually slowing and stopping, the same principle applying to temptation. According to Finney, temptation may temporarily become more noticeable or frequent when a person begins consistently resisting it, because the sensibility continues operating according to past conditioning and habit. This does not indicate failure, but reflects the gradual realignment of the emotional nature with the governing intention of the will. As the will remains firm in obedience and refuses consent, temptation weakens progressively through fixed laws of mind and habit. # text analogy, momentum of temptation. Like a spinning wheel *. Past indulgence equals momentum builds. Consistent refusal equals power cut, slows over time. Result ***, temptation fades reliably. # homework. 1 fill in the blank ***. Consent is the will's voluntary inward decision to embrace as an end. Answer: self-gratification. 2 scenario asterisk asterisk. A subtle consent starts with relaxation of resistance. Describe a daily temptation, e.g., envy, and how to prevent it using Finney's methods. 3 short answer asterisk. Explain why momentary attention is not consent, using Finney's example. 2 4 sentences. 4 multiple choice asterisk. The exact moment sin begins is when the will, A feels a pull, B becomes aware, C consents, D acts outwardly. Answer: C. 5 reflection prompt asterisk. Journal a time temptation felt stronger after resisting. How does Finney's explanation, momentum, alertness encourage you? 6 practical application asterisk. Practice immediate refusal on one temptation today. Note before-after intensity and will's role. #6 false guilt, intrusive thoughts and assurance. ## why scrupulous believers experience false guilt, even without consent. Why do scrupulous or very sensitive believers sometimes experience false guilt, even when their will has never consented at all, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney would explain false guilt, especially in sensitive, sincere believers, as the result of misjudging involuntary states of the sensibility as if they were voluntary acts of the will. In his theology, this not actual sin but an error of judgment about one's own moral state, addressing this indirectly but clearly through his teaching on moral agency, conscience, and the distinction between the will and sensibility. False guilt is not actual moral guilt, it is an error of judgment. False guilt occurs when involuntary feelings are mistaken for voluntary sin, teaching that only the will can sin, but sensitive believers often feel unwanted thoughts, emotional pulls, involuntary reactions, then conclude I must have chosen this, but the will did not choose it, the sensibility produced it automatically, the guilt coming from misinterpreting the experience not from actual consent, the conscience accusing but based on incomplete understanding. The conscience can be misinformed even when it is sincere, teaching that conscience judges according to what the intellect believes is right or wrong. If the intellect mistakenly believes that involuntary thoughts are sin, the conscience will accuse, even when the will is obedient, producing real emotional guilt but not actual moral guilt, the will remaining innocent, the conscience needing correction through truth, not repentance for something never chosen. Sensitive believers are more prone because they care deeply about obedience, observing that those most committed to holiness often examine themselves most carefully, noticing subtle internal movements, interpreting them strictly, careless people ignoring these things, sensitive believers detecting them but detection not the same as consent, their sensitivity increasing awareness, not guilt. The will may remain fully obedient while the sensibility produces unwanted thoughts, teaching that the sensibility continues to operate according to natural laws, thoughts, feelings, and impulses arising involuntarily, the will's refusal preserving obedience, but the person may still feel disturbed, this disturbance mistaken for guilt, even when the will never consented. False guilt often arises from focusing on feelings instead of intention, emphasizing that moral character is determined by intention not by emotional state. When believers evaluate themselves based on feelings instead of intention, confusion arises, feelings fluctuating, the will determining moral character. If the will remains set on God, obedience remains intact. False guilt weakens peace by creating unnecessary internal conflict, believing that unnecessary self-condemnation produces instability, the person believing they are disobedient when they are actually obedient, creating emotional distress, but the distress coming from misunderstanding, not from sin, correct understanding restoring peace. The solution is correct understanding of moral responsibility, teaching that a person is morally responsible only for voluntary choices, not involuntary feelings, not intrusive thoughts, not emotional impulses, only for what the will consents to, understanding this removing false guilt, the conscience becoming properly aligned with truth, peace increasing. Finney would counsel the person to examine their will not their feelings, asking did you choose it, did you embrace it, did your will consent? If the honest answer is no, there is no sin regardless of how disturbing the thought or feeling was, the will defining the moral state, not emotional disturbance. False guilt decreases as the intellect becomes correctly informed, believing the conscience accuses based on belief. When the intellect understands the distinction between sensibility and will, the conscience stops falsely accusing, peace following clarity, clarity correcting the conscience, correct conscience producing stability. A person is guilty only for what they will voluntarily consents to. Involuntary thoughts, feelings, and emotional disturbances do not constitute sin. False guilt arises when these involuntary states are mistaken for voluntary acts of the will. What Finney would likely say pastorally is you are condemning yourself for what you did not choose. Your sensibility may produce feelings and thoughts involuntarily, but your will has refused them. God judges the intention of the will, not the involuntary states of your feelings. You must not accuse yourself where there has been no consent. The most important truth Finney would emphasize is the will, not the feeling, is the seat of moral character. If the will remains set on God, the person remains obedient, even if the sensibility produces disturbing thoughts or feelings. Exact difference: temptation, false guilt, and true conviction. What is the exact difference between temptation, false guilt, and actual conviction of sin in Charles Finney's theology? Charles Finney made a very careful distinction between temptation, false guilt, and true conviction of sin, believing confusing these three causes enormous unnecessary anxiety and spiritual instability, with the key difference between them lying entirely in the state and action of the will, not the mere presence of feelings or thoughts. Temptation is when desire or thought is presented but the will has not consented. The first stage occurring when the intellect perceives something, the sensibility produces desire, fear, pride, or impulse, the will not yet chosen to embrace it, teaching that temptation is involuntary, arising according to natural laws of mind and association, may feel like a pull, an urge, an intrusive thought, emotional pressure, but has no moral character unless the will consents, teaching clearly that temptation is not sin. Even strong temptation is not sin. If the will refuses consent, the person remains fully obedient. False guilt is when the conscience accuses but the will has not actually consented, occurring when a person mistakenly believes they have sinned even though they will never embrace the temptation, usually happening when a person confuses feeling with choosing, thought with consent, emotional pull with intention. The conscience accusing based on misunderstanding, not based on actual consent of the will, believing the conscience can accuse incorrectly if the intellect misunderstands moral responsibility. The person feeling guilty but no real sin, the will remaining obedient, false guilt. True conviction of sin is when the will has actually consented, and the conscience correctly accuses, occurring when the will has voluntarily embraced self-gratification, inwardly agreed with temptation, chosen something contrary to God, real sin, the conscience accusing correctly, the person becoming aware of actual consent, conviction not confusion but clarity. Teaching that true conviction points specifically to the will's consent, not merely to feelings, not merely to thoughts, but to voluntary intention. The internal difference between the three is temptation feels like pressure without agreement, false guilt feels like accusation without actual consent, true conviction feels like awareness of actual voluntary consent. The difference always found in the will's action, not in emotional intensity, not in mental disturbance, only in voluntary choice. Temptation and conviction have opposite meanings. Temptation meaning the will is being presented with an alternative, conviction meaning the will has actually chosen wrongly, temptation testing obedience, conviction exposing disobedience, temptation not guilt, conviction revealing guilt. False guilt often feels emotionally intense but lacks actual voluntary consent, feeling very real emotionally, but when examined honestly the will never embrace the temptation, the person resisted it, revealing obedience, not sin, the emotional distress coming from misinterpretation, not from actual disobedience. True conviction is always connected to voluntary intention, emphasizing that true conviction always reveals a voluntary choice, not merely emotional disturbance, not merely intrusive thoughts, but actual inward consent, the will recognizing its own choice producing true conviction. Finney believed peace comes from correctly distinguishing these three, much anxiety coming from confusing temptation or false guilt with real sin. Once the distinction becomes clear, unnecessary fear decreases, the conscience becoming stable, peace increasing, because the person understands what God actually judges, God judging the will, not involuntary thoughts or feelings. Temptation is the presentation of desire without consent of the will. False guilt is the mistaken belief that consent occurred when it did not. True conviction is the conscience correctly recognizing that the will has voluntarily consented to sin. Finney's simple comparison is temptation desire appears will refuses no guilt, false guilt desire appears will refuses person mistakenly believes they sinned, true conviction desire appears will consents real guilt exists, the will determining the difference. What Finney would likely say pastorally is you must distinguish between temptation, false accusation of conscience, and real conviction of sin. God holds you responsible only for what your will chooses. If your will refuse the temptation, you have not sinned regardless of what you felt. According to Finney, temptation involves involuntary desire without consent of the will. False guilt occurs when a person mistakenly believes they consented when they did not. True conviction occurs when the will has actually embraced sin, and the conscience correctly accuses. Moral guilt exists only where the will has voluntarily consented. Text comparison table, the three states. State trigger, will's action, emotional feel, outcome. Temptation, desire appears, refuses pressure, no agreement, no guilt. False guilt ***, desire appears, refuses accusation, mistaken, false guilt. Conviction, desire appears, consents, awareness of choice, real guilt. ## intrusive thoughts versus actual unbelief. What is the difference between intrusive thoughts and actual unbelief, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney made a very clear distinction between intrusive thoughts of fear or doubt and actual unbelief, with this distinction resting entirely on his central principle that unbelief is an act of the will, not the mere presence of a thought or feeling. Intrusive thoughts arise involuntarily, while unbelief is a voluntary choice, teaching that intrusive thoughts originate in the intellect and sensibility through natural laws of association, not chosen, appearing automatically, while unbelief is when the will deliberately refuses to trust God, defining unbelief in substance as the will's refusal to confide in God and His truth, a voluntary posture, not a mental event that happens involuntarily, so the thought appearing is not unbelief. Only choosing to embrace it is unbelief. Intrusive thoughts feel unwelcome, while unbelief feels like inward agreement, pointing out this key difference that an intrusive thought feels unwanted, foreign to your true intention, producing inward resistance, while unbelief involves inward agreement, willingness to distrust, adopting distrust as your position, the will's agreement being the defining factor, not the thought's presence. Intrusive thoughts do not change the governing intention, while unbelief does, teaching that the heart is defined by the supreme intention of the will, with intrusive thoughts not changing that intention but being disturbances in the sensibility, while unbelief changing the will's governing position, a shift in allegiance. And if the will remains set on trusting God, unbelief has not occurred even if intrusive doubts appear. Intrusive thoughts may continue while genuine faith remains fully intact, teaching that faith is not the absence of contrary thoughts but the will's settled trust in God. A person experiencing thoughts of doubt while continuing to choose trust, the will remaining aligned with faith, which is real faith, the thoughts not cancelling it. Unbelief occurs when the will adopts distrust as its position, defining sin, including unbelief, as choosing self over God. In the case of unbelief, the will adopting distrust, not merely feeling uncertainty, but choosing to rely on something other than God, which is consent of the will, not involuntary mental disturbance. Intrusive thoughts often test and strengthen faith when resisted, believing temptation tests the will's governing intention. When intrusive doubts appear and the will refuses them, faith is strengthened, the will reaffirming its trust in God, reinforcing obedience, the presence of temptation not weakening faith unless the will consents. Emotional disturbance does not equal unbelief, teaching that emotional fear and intellectual doubt can arise involuntarily, belonging to the sensibility and intellect, not the will, with unbelief occurring only when the will embraces distrust, not when emotional or mental disturbance appears. The will remains fully capable of trusting God regardless of intrusive thoughts, emphasizing that the will is free, intrusive thoughts cannot force unbelief, the will retaining full power to trust God regardless of mental or emotional disturbance, preserving moral responsibility and freedom. Finney's clearest diagnostic question is asking, do you choose to trust God or do you choose to distrust Him? Not do you feel doubt or do thoughts of doubt appear, but what does your will choose? If the will chooses trust, faith is present regardless of intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts of doubt are involuntary mental events and do not constitute unbelief. Unbelief exists only when the will voluntarily adopts distrust and refuses to confide in God. Finney's simple example is intrusive doubt, where the thought appears, what if God doesn't help me? You respond inwardly, no, I trust God, which is faith, not unbelief. While unbelief being the thought appears and the will embraces it, I do not trust God, that is unbelief, the difference being the will's consent. According to Finney, intrusive thoughts of doubt or fear are involuntary disturbances in the intellect and sensibility, and do not constitute unbelief. Unbelief occurs only when the will voluntarily refuses to trust God and adopts distrust as its governing intention. If the will continues to choose trust in God, faith remains intact regardless of intrusive thoughts or emotional disturbance. ## Why sensitive, sincere believers experience more intrusive thoughts. Why do sensitive and sincere believers often experience more intrusive thoughts than careless ones, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney directly addressed why sincere, sensitive, and conscientious believers often experience more intrusive thoughts, fears, or disturbing mental impressions than careless or indifferent people, with his explanation rooted in his understanding of the sensibility, attention, conscience, and the governing intention of the will, not interpreting this as spiritual failure but often as the opposite. Because a tender conscience becomes more alert to what careless people ignore, teaching that when the will becomes fully set on obeying God, the conscience becomes more sensitive and active, explaining that careless people may have the same thoughts but do not notice or care. A sincere believer noticing them immediately because their will is set against sin, writing in substance that when the conscience is awake and active, it detects even subtle movements of the sensibility. This increased awareness making intrusive thoughts more noticeable, not more sinful, just more visible. Because resistance exposes thoughts that were previously indulged automatically, before the will is fully consecrated, certain thoughts may occur and be indulged without much resistance. After consecration, the will opposes them, creating conscious conflict. The thoughts now noticed because they are being resisted, previously passing unnoticed because they were not opposed, resistance revealing them, not causing them. Because attention becomes more disciplined and morally focused, teaching that when a person becomes serious about obedience, their attention becomes more focused on moral and spiritual truth. This increased focus making mental disturbances more apparent, the person no longer mentally drifting but morally alert, this alertness detecting disturbances that were previously ignored. Because the sensibility still operates according to past associations and conditioning, teaching that the sensibility follows fixed laws of association, past experiences may continue producing mental impressions for a time, even when the will has fully turned to God, sensitive believers more aware of these impressions, because their will opposes them. This awareness reflecting moral clarity, not moral failure. Because Satan targets those whose will is firmly set on obedience, believing that temptation is most meaningful when directed at those committed to obedience, teaching that temptation presents alternatives for the will to reject. Those firmly committed to God may experience strong temptations, not because they are weak, but because their obedience is being tested and strengthened, the will's refusal reinforcing stability. Because sincere believers often mistakenly interpret temptation as sin, teaching that many sincere believers misunderstand the distinction between sensibility and will, assuming unwanted thoughts equal consent, this misunderstanding producing unnecessary fear and anxiety, careless people not experiencing this distress, because they are not concerned with obedience, sensitive believers caring deeply, so they examine themselves more carefully. Because the will's firm opposition makes the conflict more noticeable, when the will fully opposes sin, any contrary impulse becomes immediately apparent, creating a noticeable contrast. The conflict not evidence of divided intention but evidence of moral clarity, the will and sensibility temporarily out of harmony, but the will remaining governing. Because moral sensitivity increases as spiritual maturity increases, teaching that growth in holiness increases moral sensitivity, the person becoming more aware of subtle internal movements, this sensitivity reflecting increased alignment with truth, not increased sinfulness, awareness increasing, not guilt. Because intrusive thoughts lose power when consistently refused, emphasizing that repeated refusal weakens intrusive thoughts, sensitive believers who consistently refuse consent gradually experiencing greater emotional stability, the sensibility aligning with the will over time, this process strengthening inward peace. Finney taught in substance that sincere believers often experience greater awareness of intrusive thoughts because their conscience is more sensitive and their will is firmly opposed to sin. These thoughts arise in the sensibility involuntarily and do not indicate sin unless the will consents to them. Increased awareness reflects spiritual sensitivity, not spiritual failure. What Finney would likely say pastorally in simple terms is the fact that these thoughts trouble you is evidence that your will is set against them. A careless person would not be disturbed. Your opposition to them proves that your heart is loyal. Do not mistake temptation for sin. Stand firm in your will, refuse consent, and these disturbances will gradually lose their power. According to Finney, sincere and sensitive believers often experience more intrusive thoughts because their awakened conscience and firm opposition to sin make them more aware of involuntary mental disturbances that careless people ignore. These thoughts arise automatically in the sensibility and intellect through natural laws of association and past conditioning. They do not constitute sin unless the will consents to them. The increased awareness reflects spiritual sensitivity and moral clarity, not spiritual failure or divided intention. Consistent refusal of consent gradually weakens the thoughts as the sensibility aligns with the settled governing intention of the will. Counsel for intrusive fearful thoughts that keep returning. How would Charles Finney counsel someone, specifically, with intrusive fearful thoughts that keep returning repeatedly? Charles Finney would counsel someone experiencing intrusive fearful thoughts that keep returning by carefully distinguishing between involuntary thoughts arising in the sensibility and intellect and voluntary consent of the will, and then teaching them how to govern the will and attention so those thoughts gradually lose power, with his counsel being very practical, calm and freeing, not condemning. The first assurance and most important step is that the thoughts themselves are not sin, teaching that thoughts can arise involuntarily through association, memory, nervous system reactions, past conditioning, or external stimuli, which are not acts of the will but events in the sensibility and intellect, and moral character belongs to the will, not involuntary mental events. So the thought appearing is not sin, only consenting to it is sin, and if the will rejects it there is obedience, not guilt. Warning against forceful suppression, as it often makes thoughts return more, teaching that emotional and mental states are strengthened by attention, and if a person tries to forcefully suppress the thought, they keep attention fixed on it, strengthening the mental loop, counseling against obsessively fighting the thought itself, not because resistance is wrong, but because fixation strengthens it, with the goal being to govern attention calmly, not panic. Calm refusal of consent at the level of the will, teaching a simple inward act of the will. A calm refusal, not emotional struggle, not panic, but a settled inward stance that I do not choose this, preserving obedience completely even if the thought lingers, the will remaining aligned with truth, this being the decisive point. Redirect attention toward truth and present duty, emphasizing that attention reshapes emotional and mental patterns, instructing the person to focus on present responsibilities, focus on truth, focus on obedience, focus on God, instead of continuing to analyze the intrusive thought, redirection weakening the thought's power, over time the mental association weakening. Repeated refusal gradually weakens the thoughts, believing the sensibility follows laws of habit and reinforcement, thoughts that are indulged strengthening, thoughts that are consistently refused weakening, even if they return temporarily, without reinforcement they lose strength, this process gradual but reliable. Warning against interpreting repetition as evidence of a divided heart, teaching that temptation and unwanted thoughts do not define the heart, the will's governing intention defining the heart, and if the will consistently refuses the thought, the heart remains obedient even if the thought appears repeatedly, the repetition not indicating consent, only the will's choice doing so. Settle the will firmly in trusting God, teaching that stability comes from a settled governing intention, the person firmly choosing I belong to God, I choose truth, stabilizing the will, reducing internal conflict, peace gradually increasing. Discourage excessive self-examination focused on the thoughts, warning that excessive inward examination strengthens instability, advising focusing outward on obedience, truth, duty, God, instead of repeatedly analyzing the thoughts, reducing reinforcement. Intrusive thoughts often lose strength when no longer feared, with fear itself reinforcing the mental loop, and when the person calmly refuses consent and does not panic, the thought loses its emotional charge, without emotional reinforcement it weakening, following natural psychological laws. Intrusive fearful thoughts are not sin unless your will consents to them. Calmly refuse them, do not dwell on them, fix your attention on truth and present duty, and as your will remains settled in God, these thoughts will gradually lose their power. What Finney would likely say in simple pastoral language is these thoughts do not define your character, they arise in your sensibility, not in your will. If your will refuses them and remains set on trusting God, you are obedient, do not be disturbed by their presence, turn your attention to your duty and to God. As you refuse consent, these thoughts will weaken and lose their influence. Homework. 1. Fill in the blank ***. False guilt occurs when involuntary are mistaken for voluntary sin. Answer: feelings. 2. Scenario ***. An intrusive doubt about faith appears. Is this unbelief or temptation? Explain using Finney's distinction and how to respond. 3. Short answer ***. Why do sensitive believers experience more intrusive thoughts? List 3 reasons from Finney, 3 sentences. 4. Multiple choice ***. True conviction involves A. Involuntary thoughts, B. Will's consent, C. Emotional pull only, D. Sensibility alone. Answer: B. 5. Reflection prompt ***. Journal a false guilt experience. How does misjudging sensibility as will contribute? Rewrite with Finney's correction. 6. Practical application ***. For intrusive thoughts, practice Finney's counsel, calm refusal plus redirect. Track 1 instance and outcome. 7. Building and maintaining a settled will. How to know with certainty if your ultimate intention is set on God. How can scrupulous believers know with certainty whether their ultimate intention is truly set on God, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney gave very concrete, objective tests to determine whether your ultimate intention is truly set on God, as opposed to merely having religious feelings, desires, or impressions, with his tests focusing entirely on the actual governing choice of the will, not emotions. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you choose when self and God conflict, as this was Finney's primary test. teaching that your true supreme end is shown when obedience costs you something, writing that the true intention of the mind is shown by what it chooses when duty and self-interest come into competition, asking when obedience to God conflicts with self-gratification what you choose, and if you choose obedience, your will is set on God. Not because you feel like it, but because you choose it, with the choice revealing the governing intention. Your ultimate intention is revealed by your honest willingness to obey all known duty, as Finney emphasized willingness, not perfection of performance, teaching that if your will is truly consecrated to God, you are willing to obey everything He shows you, not selectively, not partially, but universally, writing that if the will is right, there is a universal willingness to obey God, and this willingness is the evidence of true consecration. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you inwardly prefer most, teaching that the supreme end is what you ultimately prefer above all else, not emotionally but voluntarily, asking if forced to choose between pleasing God or pleasing yourself which you would choose, with your honest answer revealing your governing intention, even if self still feels attractive emotionally, and the will's preference defines the heart. Your ultimate intention is revealed by whether you resist or indulge temptation, teaching this clearly, that when temptation arises, the will must take a side, and if the will resists temptation because it chooses God, this proves consecration, while if the will embraces temptation, this reveals selfish intention, with resistance being evidence of obedience, even if the temptation feels strong. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you would choose if there were no consequences, as this was one of Finney's most penetrating tests, removing fear of punishment, fear of consequences, or fear of being seen, and what you would honestly choose reveals your true supreme end, with consecration meaning choosing God for His own sake, not merely to avoid consequences. Your ultimate intention is revealed by your present governing choice, not past failures or present feelings, as Finney strongly emphasized this, that your present intention defines your present character, not your past, not your emotional state, not your history of temptation, teaching that the question is not what you have felt but what you are choosing now, and if your will is presently set on God, that is your true character. Your ultimate intention is revealed by whether you justify sin or oppose it, teaching that when the will is set on God, it does not defend sin but opposes sin, even when tempted, even when weak emotionally, with the will remaining aligned with God's law, not because of feelings but because of choice. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you truly want to be true about yourself, believing this question exposes the will's deepest intention. Do you want to be fully obedient to God, or do you want permission to serve self, with your honest answer revealing your governing intention, even if you still struggle emotionally. Finney's clearest summary statement is from systematic theology that the supreme intention, or choice of the highest end, is the whole of moral character, meaning your governing intention defines your character, not your feelings, not your temptations, not your emotional state, with your choice defining your heart. The simplest test Finney would give is asking right now whether you choose God as your supreme end, not emotionally but voluntarily, and if yes, then your will is consecrated, even if contrary feelings exist. According to Finney, you can know your ultimate intention is set on God if your will chooses obedience over self-gratification, is willing to obey all known duty, resists temptation rather than embracing it, and prefers God above self when honestly examined, with the governing choice of the will, not involuntary feelings or emotional fluctuations, determining the true state of the heart. Why emotional pull towards sin persists, even with a set will. Why may a person still feel emotionally drawn towards sin, even while their will is fully set against it, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney taught very clearly that a person may still feel emotionally drawn towards sin, even when their will is fully set against it, explaining this as a normal consequence of how the sensibility operates according to natural laws, which do not instantly change when the will changes its supreme intention. Sensibility operates involuntarily according to fixed laws, as Finney wrote in Systematic Theology that the sensibility is involuntary, and its states are produced by causes over which the will has no direct control, meaning feelings arise automatically in response to memories, associations, bodily conditions, external stimuli, or past habits, even when the will has fully chosen obedience, and the will cannot instantly shut off emotional responses but can only choose whether to consent. Past indulgence leaves lasting emotional tendencies, as Finney taught that when desires have been indulged in the past, the sensibility becomes conditioned, and this conditioning does not disappear instantly when the will repents, with the will changing immediately but the sensibility adjusting gradually, because emotional responses follow laws of association and habit, and the old emotional patterns weaken over time as the will consistently refuses indulgence. The intellect continues to perceive objects that naturally produce feelings, as Finney taught that when the intellect perceives something desirable, the sensibility naturally responds, which is automatic. For example, if the intellect perceives something previously associated with pleasure, the sensibility produces desire, occurring even when the will rejects it, with the perception triggering the emotional response, not the will. The sensibility was designed to respond to perceived good or evil, as Finney taught that the sensibility itself is not sinful, but was created to respond to perceived value, producing attraction toward what appears pleasurable and aversion toward what appears painful, with these reactions occurring automatically, and sin existing only if the will chooses self-gratification, not when the sensibility produces desire. The will and sensibility are distinct faculties that do not change simultaneously, as Finney emphasized that conversion is a change in the will's governing intention, not an instant elimination of all contrary feelings, writing that holiness consists in the supreme intention of the will, not saying holiness consists in having no contrary emotional impulses, with the will changing immediately but the sensibility following progressively. Temptation requires the presence of alternative desires, as Finney taught that moral freedom requires alternatives, and if the sensibility could never produce desires contrary to obedience, temptation would not exist, and moral choice would not be meaningful, with temptation presenting options and the will choosing between them, and the existence of temptation not contradicting obedience but making obedience meaningful. The sensibility gradually comes into harmony with the will through repeated obedience, as Finney wrote that the feelings will come to correspond with the action of the will, which is progressive, not instantaneous, and as the will consistently refuses sinful indulgence, the sensibility gradually changes, with desires weakening and new emotional patterns developing, but this process takes time. Christ himself experienced emotional distress and temptation while remaining perfectly obedient, as Finney pointed to Christ as the clearest example, who experienced intense hunger, emotional agony and distress, yet his will remained perfectly consecrated, proving emotional experience does not contradict consecration, with the will determining moral character, not emotional state. Emotional attraction does not equal voluntary intention, as Finney made this distinction very clearly, that feeling drawn towards something is not the same as choosing it, with choice belonging to the will and attraction belonging to the sensibility, and the will may fully reject what the sensibility feels, which is temptation, not sin. A person may feel emotional attraction towards sin because the sensibility continues to operate according to natural laws and past conditioning, even after the will has fully consecrated itself to God, and these involuntary feelings are not sin unless the will consents to them. Finney's simplest real-life illustration is that a person may feel fear when doing their duty, and the fear does not mean they have chosen cowardice, and if their will chooses duty, they remain faithful, with the feeling not defining their character but the choice doing so. According to Finney, emotional attraction towards sin can continue even when the will is fully set against sin, because feelings arise involuntarily in the sensibility due to natural laws, past associations, and external stimuli. Conversion changes the governing intention of the will immediately, but the sensibility gradually comes into harmony with that intention. Therefore, unwanted desires do not indicate a sinful heart unless the will consents to them. How to weaken unwanted desires, Finney's fastest method. How can scrupulous believers weaken unwanted desires in the fastest and most effective way, according to Charles Finney? Charles Finney taught that unwanted desires weaken most effectively not by trying to directly suppress feelings, but by governing the will, attention, and habits in accordance with truth, believing the sensibility changes fastest when the will consistently refuses indulgence and actively strengthens opposite patterns. To do this, firmly and decisively refuse consent every time, as this was Finney's most important principle, teaching that the will must take a clear, decisive stand against temptation, not negotiate, not linger, not debate with it, but reject it, writing that if the will refuses consent, sin does not exist and temptation may remain, but it has no moral character, with every refusal weakening the desire's influence and every consent strengthening it, and the will being the control point. Immediately withdraw attention from the temptation, as Finney taught that attention is the fuel that strengthens desire, writing that the will controls attention and attention strengthens whatever it rests on. So if attention remains on the temptation, the emotional intensity grows, but if attention is withdrawn, the emotional intensity weakens, which is a fixed psychological law in his system, emphasizing redirecting the mind deliberately, not passively waiting for feelings to change. Positively fix the mind on God, truth, and right action, as Finney taught that the mind cannot remain in a neutral vacuum, and attention must move towards something else, writing that spiritual strength increases by actively fixing the mind on truth, not merely resisting error but actively embracing truth, which strengthens the governing intention and reshapes emotional patterns. Refuse all outward and inward indulgence, as Finney taught that indulgence includes not only actions but inward mental indulgence, warning that mental indulgence strengthens desire just as much as outward indulgence, emphasizing complete refusal, not partial refusal, not outward restraint with inward indulgence, but full inward and outward rejection, which stops reinforcement of the emotional pattern. Establish new habits of obedience immediately, as Finney taught that habit is one of the strongest forces shaping the sensibility, writing that repeated obedience establishes new patterns, and the sensibility gradually conforms to these patterns through consistent repetition, not occasional effort, with consistency being critical. Avoid situations that unnecessarily trigger temptation while strengthening new patterns, as Finney believed wisdom includes avoiding unnecessary exposure to temptation while the sensibility is still adjusting, which is not weakness but intelligent cooperation with psychological law, teaching that reducing triggers accelerates emotional realignment. Strengthen the opposite affection, as Finney taught that love for God weakens love for self-gratification, and the stronger the governing intention becomes, the weaker contrary desires become, emphasizing cultivating genuine love for God as the supreme end, not merely suppressing desire but replacing it. Maintain a steady, settled governing intention, as Finney emphasized stability, not constant redeciding but maintaining a firm, settled intention, and when the will remains steady, the sensibility gradually stabilizes around it, with instability slowing progress and consistency accelerating it. Understand that weakening occurs through fixed laws, not emotional force. As Finney emphasized that feelings weaken through disuse, not through emotional struggle, not through force but through consistent non-indulgence, which is gradual but reliable, teaching that this process is governed by natural laws established by God. When the will steadily refuses to gratify desire and fixes itself on God as the supreme end, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony, and the desires lose their power, which is inevitable if obedience remains consistent. A simple analogy Finney would agree with is that a path in a field becomes worn by repeated walking, and if walking stops, grass gradually grows over it, and if a new path is used, it becomes the stronger path, with desire following the same law that indulgence strengthens and refusal weakens. According to Finney, unwanted desires weaken most effectively when the will consistently refuses consent, withdraws attention from temptation, fixes the mind on truth, establishes habits of obedience, and strengthens love for God as the supreme end. The sensibility gradually conforms to the governing intention of the will through fixed psychological and spiritual laws, causing desires to weaken through disuse and replacement.